It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the kind where people shuffled in and out of the local grocery store, balancing their weekly errands with the slow rhythm of the weekend. The automatic doors slid open and closed endlessly, welcoming a steady flow of shoppers. Among them was a man in his late 30s, dressed in a neat button-up shirt and jeans, carrying a calm but confident demeanor. His dark skin glowed under the store's fluorescent lights, and his warm smile hinted at someone who felt at ease with the world, or so it seemed. As he wandered the aisles, picking up a box of cereal here, a carton of milk there, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, the kind of feeling you might dismiss as paranoia. But as he reached for a loaf of bread, he caught a glimpse of someone from the corner of his eye. A store employee stood at the end of the aisle, pretending to adjust a shelf but clearly watching him. The man's smile faltered. He glanced around, trying to shake off the unease, but the employee stayed put, their eyes darting away only when met with his. He tried to ignore it and continued shopping, moving toward the produce section. But the feeling followed him, growing heavier with each step. This time, it wasn't just the employee. A security guard had joined the silent surveillance, standing a little too close for comfort as the man carefully examined a bunch of bananas. The guard wasn't subtle, arms crossed, eyes locked on him like he was a puzzle that needed solving. The man sighed, placing the bananas into his cart. He wasn't a stranger to this kind of attention, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. He had no intention of creating a scene, but the weight of judgment pressed on him. Every movement he made, every product he picked up, felt scrutinized. He straightened his shoulders, determined to finish his shopping and leave. Then came the moment that changed everything. As he approached the checkout line, a voice cut through the hum of the store. "Excuse me, sir. Could you come with me for a moment?" The security guard's tone was firm but polite, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. The man froze, every pair of eyes in the store suddenly on him. "For what?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a quiet frustration. "We've received a report of suspicious activity," the guard replied. The man's heart sank. He knew what this was. He had seen it play out 100 times on the news, but now it was his reality. A crowd began to gather, curious whispers filling the space. Mothers with children, elderly couples, teenagers all stopped to watch the unfolding drama. The man felt their stares like a spotlight, their unspoken questions cutting deeper than the guard's words. Was he a thief? Did he do something wrong? "I don't understand," the man said, trying to keep his composure. "What's suspicious activity?" "We'll need to check your belongings," the guard insisted, motioning toward his cart. "If you could just step aside." The man hesitated, glancing around at the growing audience. He could feel the judgment in their eyes, the assumptions being made in real time. His hands gripped the handle of his cart, his mind racing. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being publicly accused, humiliated. But he wasn't about to let this moment define him. Taking a deep breath, he nodded and followed the guard, the crowd parting like a wave to let them pass. The silence was deafening as they moved toward a small room near the back of the store. The man glanced over his shoulder one last time, catching the gaze of a little boy clutching his mother's hand. The boy's wide eyes were filled with confusion, and for a brief moment, the man saw a reflection of himself as a child, innocent, hopeful, unaware of the harsh realities that would one day confront him. What happened next would not only change the course of that day but ripple far beyond the walls of the store. The truth behind the guard's actions, the assumptions made, and the reason this man was singled out would soon come to light, and it would shock everyone involved. As the man was led away, the store's buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, as if they were amplifying the weight of every second. The guard's footsteps echoed across the linoleum floor, a stark reminder of how fast the situation was spiraling. He felt his stomach tighten, his breath becoming shallow, as his mind raced with a mix of anger, disbelief, and confusion. Why him? Why now? His name wasn't important, no one needed to know who he was. But in that moment, he wasn't just one person, one shopper among many. He was every black man who had ever felt the sting of being watched, scrutinized, and judged by society. Every time he had been overlooked for a job, stared at too long in a store, or been followed down the street by someone who assumed the worst of him. But this time, the spotlight was brighter. The eyes of the store's customers were all on him. As they entered the small back room, the security guard motioned for him to stand against the wall. The man complied without saying a word, his body tense. A second guard, a woman this time, stood by a table with a clipboard in hand. She gave him a quick glance before looking down at the paper, making notes. It was clear she didn't want to make eye contact. "We just need to go through your things," the woman said, her voice flat and professional. "You'll be free to go once we're done." The man's heart raced as the guard began to sift through his bag, pulling out the items he'd purchased earlier. A loaf of bread, some eggs, a carton of milk, a few vegetables. All the while, the silence stretched between them, thick with tension. He couldn't help but think of how trivial it all seemed, this moment of unnecessary suspicion. It wasn't like he was carrying anything that didn't belong to him. In fact, it felt almost absurd that he was being treated like a criminal over a grocery store haul. "You mind telling me what this is about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though his frustration bubbled under the surface. "You've got no reason to treat me like this." The guard didn't reply. Instead, she continued her methodical search, scanning his items with a detached indifference. Every so often, she would look up at him, her gaze cold, but she never spoke. The man felt his frustration building, but he held his ground. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated unfairly, but something about this moment felt different. The injustice, the public humiliation, it was all too much to ignore. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The guard, still silent, opened it, revealing the store manager. A middle-aged woman with short, graying hair and an air of authority about her. She was dressed in the typical manager's uniform, black polo shirt and khakis, and had a clipboard in hand as well. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, her voice businesslike, though there was a hint of concern behind her words. The guard looked over at the man, then back at the manager. "Just doing a routine check," the guard replied. The manager gave the man a quick once-over, then turned back to the guard. "Any reason to think he's stolen something?" The guard hesitated, but after a moment, she nodded slowly. "We got a call. Said someone saw him acting suspicious near the electronics aisle. Looked like he was trying to hide something in his bag." The manager raised an eyebrow. "And did you see anything in the bag?" The guard shook her head. "Nothing yet, but we're still going through it." The manager didn't seem convinced. "You're sure?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but protocol's protocol." The manager paused, her gaze drifting back to the man. She studied him carefully, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and the man could hear the faint hum of voices through the thin walls. His mind began to race as he wondered what was happening out there, what they were saying about him. The woman guard finally stopped her inspection. "All right, you're free to go," she said, her tone more neutral than before. The man didn't move at first. "Just like that?" he asked, his voice still laced with disbelief. "You're just going to let me go?" She gave him a brief glance but didn't respond immediately. Finally, she sighed. "Look, we don't normally do this. It's just that sometimes people get suspicious when they see something they don't understand. It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" The man's voice grew sharper. "You followed me around this whole store like I was a criminal. You didn't even bother to ask if I needed help. You just assumed the worst." The woman winced slightly, but still said nothing. He stood there for a moment, taking in her lack of apology, the cold professionalism that only seemed to deepen the sting of his experience. Without another word, he grabbed his bag and walked out of the small room. As he passed through the hallway and back to the front of the store, he could feel the eyes of the customers on him again. This time, however, he didn't look at them. He kept his head down, his heart pounding, his hands clenching the straps of his bag so tightly it almost hurt. When he reached the exit, the automatic doors slid open in front of him, and he stepped out into the bright sunlight. For a moment, everything seemed still, almost too still. He paused for a moment outside the store, taking a deep breath. His nerves were still on edge, but there was something else, too, an unsettling feeling, as if the whole situation was part of something bigger, something that had yet to unfold. He needed to get out of there. He needed to process what had just happened, but his mind was already racing ahead, wondering what was next. Was this just a misunderstanding, or was there more to this story than met the eye? What if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and no one had bothered to investigate? The thought lingered in the back of his mind, unsettling him. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was out there, but it wasn't what he had expected. The truth wasn't about what happened in the store. It was about why it happened, and what would happen next. What kind of world were they living in, where a simple trip to the store could spiral into something so much darker? Little did he know, that brief interaction in the grocery store was just the beginning. The following days would bring more twists and turns than he could have imagined, and the answers he was searching for would come from the most unexpected places. And yet, despite all the confusion, one thing remained clear: this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. Something that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. As he sat in his car, the engine running but the car unmoving, the man couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of unease. The sun beat down on the windshield, casting harsh shadows inside the vehicle. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He should have felt relief, but all he could feel was the deep, gnawing frustration that had taken root in his chest. What had just happened at that store? What had they been thinking? The questioning, the stares, he couldn't escape it. What bothered him most wasn't that he had been accused of something he hadn't done. It was that the entire ordeal felt so familiar. Like it was happening to so many others, and yet nothing ever seemed to change. How many times had he heard stories from friends, family, even strangers, all recounting similar experiences of being treated like criminals because of their skin? But now, this was his story. And as much as he tried to reason with himself that he should move on, let it go, something about it kept nagging at him. He wasn't going to let it go. The man started the car and drove aimlessly, his mind working overtime. He knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. The truth was, he had felt the weight of being misjudged before, but today had felt different. It wasn't just a matter of racial profiling, it was something deeper, more personal. What was it that triggered the suspicion in the first place? He didn't have an answer yet, but he wasn't about to leave it at that. Meanwhile, the store itself was buzzing with tension of its own. The manager, still unsettled by the scene she'd witnessed earlier, stood in her office, pacing back and forth. She had been doing this job for years, handling everything from simple customer complaints to more serious security issues, but today had thrown her for a loop. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the man's presence or the guard's behavior. There was something about the way he'd been treated that didn't sit right with her. She had seen how the guard had acted toward him, how he had been so quick to assume the worst, so eager to involve her without any clear evidence. It wasn't normal. Something didn't add up, and she couldn't ignore it. There was also the issue of the other employees. The way they had glanced over at the man when he first entered the store, their eyes darting away as soon as they met his gaze. Was it fear? Distrust? Her phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, seeing a new message from the security office. Her eyes scanned it quickly, then narrowed. Incident report attached. Please review immediately. She felt a pit form in her stomach. She hadn't asked for a report yet. She was trying to process everything. The manager opened the document, her eyes scanning the lines of text, the words jumping out at her. The security guard had filed a report about a suspicious male customer who was attempting to conceal items in his bag but had ultimately not been found with any stolen goods. She read it over twice, each word feeling more troubling than the last. It was clear to her that there had been no valid reason to accuse the man of theft, yet the situation had escalated rapidly. Why? And what if the man had felt the weight of their assumptions? What if he had felt cornered, vulnerable, powerless? She sat down at her desk, her mind racing. The man didn't deserve this treatment, she was certain of that. But how could she make things right? What could she do when the only thing she had was a report written by someone who had acted impulsively, perhaps out of some ingrained bias? She knew she couldn't just brush it off. She needed to investigate. She needed to understand how this had happened. She couldn't let another person leave her store feeling like they had been wrong. But as she sat there, the reality of her situation sank in. She was just one person. One manager, trying to do the right thing in a world that seemed to be full of misunderstandings and assumptions. How much could one person change? She had no answers yet, but she knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Something deeper was at play. Back in the car, the man's thoughts circled back to the store, and the scene that had played out. He couldn't help but wonder who had been watching him, really. The employee who had first looked his way. The guard who had approached him with such certainty. Or maybe it was just the whole store, everyone who had been involved in the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong there. The familiar pang of frustration rose in his chest once again. He had been raised to believe in fairness, in truth. But today, he had been shown that for some people, fairness was a luxury, something reserved for those who fit a specific mold, a specific narrative. He didn't fit that mold. He never had. And that, more than anything, stung. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a text from a close friend, one who had lived through similar experiences. They had known each other for years, and their shared stories of being mistreated, disrespected by the system had formed the foundation of their friendship. He read the text. You okay? I saw what happened at the store. You good? He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. I'm fine. But something's not right. I'm going to figure this out. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he couldn't let this go. There were too many unanswered questions. What had triggered the suspicion in the first place? Was there someone behind it all? Someone who had set the chain of events in motion? Or was this just the result of a system that had long ago made assumptions about people who looked like him? He wasn't going to let himself be swept under the rug, not this time. The store may have let him go without charges, but that didn't mean he would let them off the hook. Not by a long shot. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his mind was already racing toward the next steps. He would go back to the store, speak to the manager, find out who had called in the report. He would make sure that everyone involved in this injustice understood that it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, it was part of something bigger. Something that had to be addressed, once and for all. The story was far from over. The questions he had raised were just beginning to unfold. And he would see it through to the end, no matter where it led. As the man drove away, a chill ran down his spine. There was something unsettling about the entire situation, something that gnawed at him. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was walking into something much bigger than he could have ever anticipated. The next day, The man returned to the store, his heart beating faster than usual as he pulled into the parking lot. The place looked the same as it always did, familiar faces, carts rolling down aisles, the hum of fluorescent lights above. But today felt different. His stomach twisted with a sense of unease that had settled deep within him since the incident. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. A confrontation? An apology? Maybe just answers. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't walk away without some form of resolution. Not after everything that had happened. As he entered the store, the doors slid open with their usual hum, but the atmosphere inside felt tense. He could feel the weight of the stares from the employees behind the counter, their eyes glancing quickly before shifting away, as if they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. The same guard from yesterday stood near the entrance, but this time he didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. The man could tell that they knew he was back. He walked through the aisles with a purposeful stride, heading straight for the manager's office. He wasn't here to shop today. He wasn't here to make small talk. He was here to get to the bottom of what had happened the day before, to find out why he had been treated like a criminal when he'd done nothing wrong. As he reached the door to the office, he hesitated for a moment. The door was ajar, and he could hear voices inside. One of them was the manager's. She was speaking with someone in low, hurried tones. His instincts told him to knock to introduce himself, but something about the conversation stopped him in his tracks. There was a sense of urgency in her voice that piqued his curiosity. It wasn't just about what happened to him, it felt like something else was going on, something bigger. The door creaked as he pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The manager was sitting at her desk, a frown on her face, while a woman in a business suit stood across from her. The woman's back was to the door, so the man couldn't see her face, but he could hear the edge in her voice. "You need to understand, this is about more than just what happened in the store," the woman said, her voice cold. "We have a reputation to maintain. These situations can escalate quickly, and it's in the best interest of the store and the community that we act swiftly." The manager looked conflicted. "But what about the truth? What about the customer? This isn't about protecting the store, it's about making sure no one gets unjustly accused." The woman's tone sharpened. "You have a responsibility here, and if you're not careful, this will blow up into something much worse. The last thing we need is for this to go public." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The man's heart raced, and his instincts told him he shouldn't be listening, but the conversation had caught him off guard. What was this about? Reputation? Public perception? What was going on behind the scenes? He pushed the door open a little wider, trying to make out the rest of the conversation. "Don't you think I know what's at stake?" The manager snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "But this isn't right. We can't cover it up. If we're not honest about what happened, if we sweep this under the rug, we'll be fine," the woman interrupted. "You're making this harder than it has to be." The manager fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then, the woman spoke again, her words slower, more measured. "I'll take care of it. You don't need to worry about anything else. Just don't make waves." The man's pulse quickened. What was going on? What was the woman referring to when she talked about making waves? What was so important that the truth had to be hidden? He pulled back from the door just as it began to swing open. He froze, his heart racing. The woman in the suit walked out of the office, her face now visible. She was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating expression. She didn't notice him standing there as she passed, her footsteps quick and purposeful. But as she moved past him, their eyes briefly met, and the man could see it in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, something that told him she knew exactly who he was. His thoughts spun as he tried to process what he had just overheard. Who was she? And why was she so intent on covering up the truth? He needed to get answers, but his mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't just walk away now. He had to know more. He turned back toward the office, his nerves on edge. He had to speak to the manager. There was no turning back now. When he knocked on the door, there was a brief moment of silence before the manager's voice called out, "Come in." He stepped inside, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. The manager looked up at him, her expression tight, but there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "You're back," she said, her voice a little softer than before. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I need answers," the man said, his tone firm. "I overheard part of your conversation. What's going on here? Who was that woman? And why are you so intent on covering this up?" The manager's face strained of color, and for a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something. But then her gaze dropped to the desk, her hands fidgeting nervously. She was clearly weighing her options, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know what you heard," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can tell you that I've been trying to do the right thing. This isn't easy for me either. There's a lot at stake here, and sometimes the truth isn't enough." The words hung in the air like a weight, and the man felt his frustration build again. He needed answers, but the more he asked, the more it seemed like he was getting tangled in a web of secrecy and lies. "Tell me what's really going on," he pressed. "What aren't you telling me?" Before she could respond, the door to the office suddenly opened again, this time with force. The woman in the suit was back, her expression more serious than before. She didn't even look at the man as she walked straight into the room, her presence commanding. "We need to talk," she said, her voice icy. "This conversation is over." The manager didn't argue. She stood up, her eyes filled with confusion, and for the first time, the man saw fear in her face. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: the truth was about to come crashing down. And whatever it was, he was in the middle of it now, whether he liked it or not. The woman in the suit didn't waste any time. As soon as she entered the office, her gaze fixed firmly on the manager, her expression colder than ever. Without a word to the man, she shut the door behind her with a sharp click that echoed through the room, making him jump slightly. The tension between them hung thick in the air. He could feel it, the weight of whatever was unfolding here. The manager's hands trembled as she placed them on the desk, her eyes darting nervously between the man and the woman. The man stood there, caught in the middle, his confusion growing by the second. Whatever had been said before the secrets, the pressure, it was all coming to a head now. "I told you to leave this alone," the woman said, her voice now like ice. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The manager's voice cracked as she replied, barely audible, "I'm just trying to do the right thing. I can't pretend it didn't happen." "Pretend? You think this is about right and wrong?" The woman's voice was almost mocking now. "This is about protecting the store, protecting our business. It's not just about what happened with him." She nodded towards the man, who stood frozen by the door. "It's bigger than that." The man's mind raced as the words hit him like a wave. Bigger than that? What did she mean? Was there more to this than just his own experience? He could feel a knot tighten in his stomach as he realized that the truth, whatever it was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. And he was right in the middle of it. The woman turned to the manager, her expression hardening. "You've already made it worse by involving him. Now we have to clean it up." The man's pulse quickened. What was happening? What were they trying to cover up? He couldn't keep standing there in silence. He had come here for answers, and he wasn't about to back down. "Clean up what?" he demanded, his voice strong despite the confusion swirling inside him. "What's going on? What's really happening here?" The woman's gaze snapped to him for the first time since she'd entered. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he felt like he was being scrutinized, as if she were calculating her next move. "You should leave," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "You don't want to be a part of this. Trust me." "Why?" he asked, his frustration bubbling over. "Because I know too much now?" "What do you mean bigger than that?" For a split second, he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, like a mask slipping for just a moment. But then she was back to her icy, unflinching demeanor. "You really want to know?" "Fine," she said, almost as if she were toying with him. "There's a lot more at stake than just you and your little incident. This is about what happens when the store's reputation is questioned, about the money that's tied to it. Do you really think anyone cares about the truth when there's this much on the line?" The words stung more than he'd expected, and he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. It wasn't just about him anymore. Whatever had happened with him was just the tip of the iceberg. The manager stood silently beside the desk, her face pale, her hands still trembling. She didn't speak, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was stuck, caught between the truth and the pressure of something far greater. Whatever this woman in the suit was talking about, it wasn't just a few misplaced assumptions or a rushed accusation. There was something bigger, something more sinister going on behind the scenes. Before he could respond, the door to the office swung open again. This time, it wasn't the woman in the suit who entered, it was someone else entirely, someone the man didn't expect. A man in a dark suit, his face stern and impassive, walked in with an air of authority that immediately shifted the energy in the room. The woman turned to him with a flicker of recognition, and he could see the manager visibly stiffen at the sight of him. "I'm glad you're here," the woman said, her tone now respectful, even deferential. "We've got a problem." The man in the dark suit didn't acknowledge the woman's greeting. Instead, he turned to the manager, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I heard you were causing problems," he said bluntly, his voice cold, and no nonsense. The manager's throat tightened, but she didn't back down. "I'm not causing problems. I'm trying to make sure the truth is heard." The man in the suit smirked, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "The truth is whatever we decide it is," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And right now, the truth is that this store can't afford any more bad press. I suggest you remember that." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. They weren't just trying to cover up his incident, they were willing to do whatever it took to protect the store from bad press, no matter the cost. And that cost, he realized, might be far greater than just his reputation. The manager opened her mouth, as if to protest, but the man in the suit held up a hand, silencing her. His gaze flicked back to the woman in the suit, and for a brief moment, they exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The man was beginning to understand just how deep the web of deceit ran. He had come here looking for answers, but now it seemed like the more he uncovered, the more questions he had. What was the store really hiding? And how far were they willing to go to protect their secrets? The tension in the room was palpable, and the man could feel the walls closing in around him. He was out of his depth, and for the first time since he'd walked into the store the day before, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a mistake by digging into this? Was he getting too close to something that would change everything? Before he could fully process the situation, the man in the dark suit turned to him with a cold smile, his words a sharp warning, "I suggest you leave. Now. And don't come back." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with threat, as the man stood frozen, torn between walking away and pushing forward into the unknown. The stakes had been raised, he was no longer just fighting for his own dignity. This was bigger than him. And whatever the truth was, he knew he couldn't walk away without it. The man stood still, his heart hammering in his chest as the words of the man in the dark suit echoed in his mind. "I suggest you leave. Now. The cold warning lingered in the air, suffocating him. He had reached the point of no return. All the pieces of this puzzle had started to fall into place, but there was still one thing that nagged at him: the truth. He couldn't walk away now. Not when he was so close. He took a step forward, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his head. I'm not leaving. Not until I understand what's really going on here. The man in the dark suit's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. He stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming, as if trying to intimidate the man into submission. You think you're in control of this situation? You don't know who you're dealing with. For a moment, the man hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected next, whether they would drag him out of the store or just throw him out like a nuisance. But then, something unexpected happened. The manager, who had been silent up until that point, spoke up, her voice shaking but resolute. He's right. He deserves the truth. We can't keep hiding it anymore. The man in the dark suit froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. What did you say? I said we can't hide it anymore, the manager repeated, her tone more forceful now. The truth needs to come out. The room was thick with tension as the man watched the two of them, unsure of what was happening. It was as if the power dynamic had shifted in an instant. The manager, who had been so hesitant before, was now standing up for what was right. And for a moment, he could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of the consequences that would follow, but also a glimmer of resolve. The woman in the suit's expression soured, her mouth tightening as she exchanged a glance with the man in the dark suit. You don't know what you're doing, she said, her voice laced with venom. You think this will end well for you? The manager didn't back down. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for him. She pointed at the man, her voice unwavering. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves more than being a pawn in your game. The man in the dark suit let out a frustrated sigh and turned to the manager. You've made a huge mistake. But I'll give you one last chance. Walk away now, and we'll pretend this never happened. But the manager shook her head, her resolve unshaken. No. This has gone on long enough. With that, the tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. The man in the dark suit's eyes flicked to the woman in the suit, and for a split second, he seemed to weigh his options. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving the woman behind. The man was left standing there, a mix of disbelief and relief flooding over him. For a moment, everything was silent. The manager slowly sank back into her chair, exhaling deeply as if the weight of the moment had finally lifted. You were right, she said, her voice quiet now, almost apologetic. We couldn't keep this going. I'm sorry for what you've had to endure. He took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly begin to drain from his body. What's the truth? What was all this really about? The manager hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Then she met his gaze, her face filled with a mixture of regret and determination. The store. It's been under investigation for months, she confessed. There's been a lot of pressure to make sure certain things don't get out. But the thing is, the accusations weren't about you at all. It wasn't even your fault. You were just caught up in something bigger. The man's confusion deepened. What do you mean? Those products you were accused of stealing. They were part of a larger scheme, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The store has been caught up in a supply chain scandal. Some of the merchandise, high-end electronics, luxury items has been illegally marked down and sold through back channels. The woman you saw in here, she gestured toward the door, she works for the company that's been overseeing this operation. The pieces clicked into place, and the man felt a wave of realization wash over him. The store had been trying to keep the truth buried. His confrontation, his supposed theft, had all been part of a diversion to protect a much larger scandal. "But why me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper now. "Why target me?" The manager's expression turned grim. They needed someone to take the fall. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. And you? You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a moment, the man just stared at her, processing the shocking revelation. The anger he felt at the accusation, at the treatment he had endured, began to feel small compared to the enormity of what was really going on. The store's reputation was just the tip of the iceberg. The truth was far darker than he could have imagined. Before he could speak, the office door swung open once more, and this time, it wasn't anyone they had been expecting. It was the woman in the suit. She walked in calmly, as if nothing had happened, her eyes cold as steel. "You shouldn't have done that," she said to the manager. Her tone was deadly quiet. The man stiffened, instinctively moving toward the door, but before he could react, the woman closed it behind her with a soft click. She stepped closer, and he could see something in her eyes now, something far more dangerous than anything he had encountered yet. She wasn't just a corporate enforcer. She was something far worse. "The truth's already out," the man said, his voice growing steady. "You can't stop it now." She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had already calculated every move. "You think the truth is out?" she said, her voice low. "You have no idea." And in that moment, the man realized the biggest twist of all. The truth wasn't over. It had just begun. The woman in the suit didn't budge as she locked eyes with him. The air in the room grew thick again, the tension rising even higher than before. She didn't speak immediately, but the quiet was enough to tell the man that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You really think the truth is out, don't you?" she repeated, her voice cool but with a subtle edge. "You think you've uncovered everything just because you got a glimpse behind the curtain?" The man stood there, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had come here looking for answers, and now, it felt like he was deeper in the rabbit hole than ever before. The pieces of the puzzle had never seemed to fit properly, and now everything was fractured and unclear. "No," he said, his voice firm despite the unease creeping in. "But I'm not walking away. Not without knowing what's really happening here." The woman chuckled softly, a sound that felt like it was laced with more than a little mockery. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're also naive if you think you're in control of this situation. The truth you're looking for is just the beginning of a much larger story. And it's not one you want to be a part of." Her words hit him like a jolt, but he refused to back down. This had gone on long enough. He had already endured so much. The mystery, the lies, the accusations, all of it had torn through his life like a whirlwind. But now, standing in front of this woman, he realized just how far the conspiracy stretched. What had seemed like a simple misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity, was actually part of something far darker and more complicated. He had to know how deep it went. "I don't care about your threats," he said, his voice steady but determined. "I need to know why." The woman's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. She studied him for a moment, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something resembling respect. "You really don't know, do you?" "What?" he asked, confused. "This store," she began, her voice lowering, "has always been part of a larger operation. It's not just about the products on the shelves or the customers who walk in and out. It's about controlling something bigger, a network that spans beyond the city, beyond even the state. And you've stumbled right into it. The merchandise, the deals, the illegal contracts, it's all connected." His heart pounded in his chest as he listened, each word making the world feel smaller, as if everything he thought he knew about the store and his own life was about to be upended. She wasn't just talking about the scandal he'd uncovered. She was talking about something far more sinister, something that no one could have anticipated. This isn't just about what happened to you, she continued, her tone almost conversational now. It's about control, power, money. And you? You're a pawn in the game. The man struggled to digest her words. A pawn? He repeated, his voice shaking with disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. I'm not part of any game. I just got caught up in your mess. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You don't get it. You think it's just about a stolen item, or a wrongful accusation. But it's bigger than that. The people pulling the strings don't care about individual lives. They don't care about you or your truth. What matters is keeping the operation running smoothly. And anyone who threatens that, well, they have a way of disappearing. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard rumors about things like this before, whispers of corrupt businesses, hidden agendas, and dirty deals, but hearing it from her mouth made it all too real. The weight of what she was saying hung heavy in the air. And suddenly, the idea of walking away didn't seem so simple anymore. He took a step back, his mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. He hadn't just been a victim of a wrongful accusation. He had been part of something much larger, a pawn in a dangerous game. He had thought the store was just a place where he worked, but now he understood that it was part of a much darker world, one filled with secrets, lies, and corruption. You think I'm just going to walk away? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, though the words carried an intensity that filled the room. You think I'm going to forget all of this? She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she stared at him with a look that made him feel like he was being sized up, like she was trying to decide whether he was worth her time or not. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost apologetic. I don't want to hurt you. I never did. But you've already crossed the line. Now there's no going back. Before he could respond, the door to the office opened once again. This time, it wasn't the man in the dark suit or the woman in the suit. It was someone entirely different. A figure stepped into the room, someone he had never seen before. Their face was partially hidden by a hat, and their body language was calm, almost too calm. The woman in the suit turned toward the newcomer with a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't seem threatened. Instead, she tilted her head, as if expecting this person. You're late, she said, her voice colder than before. I had to make sure everything was in place, the newcomer replied, their voice low and deliberate. The man felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine. Who was this person? And why did it feel like everything had just escalated to a new level? The woman in the suit glanced at him again, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like sympathy in her eyes. You're in over your head, you know that, right? He didn't say anything. He couldn't. His mind was spinning with everything that had happened, everything he had learned. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation anymore. It was a fight for his life, for the truth, for everything that had been hidden from him. As the room filled with silence, the newcomer stepped forward, pulling a small device from their pocket. We have everything we need, they said, their voice sharp with finality. It's over. The woman in the suit nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. The newcomer followed her, leaving the man standing there, alone in the office, with more questions than answers. For a long moment, the man stood there, his thoughts a blur of confusion, anger, and fear. The walls that had seemed so solid just moments ago now felt fragile, like they could come crashing down at any second. And then it hit him. The truth. It wasn't about the store. It wasn't about the people he had met. It was about him. It was about how far he was willing to go to expose the lies, no matter the cost. As the door clicked shut behind them, he realized that he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let the truth be buried again. The stakes were too high, and if he walked away now, everything he had uncovered, everything he had learned, would be lost. He wasn't ready to let that happen. The man took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. He was going to make sure the truth was known. No matter what.